Hey guys, I recently got a question in my members area about the wrist and the forearm and what exactly is happening on a topspin serve. So when we're hitting a topspin serve, is the wrist doing anything or is it snapping or something? So one of my members said that he knows that the wrist is not snapping, so snapping means something like this. So wrist is not snapping when we do topspin serve. But then the suggestion was, well, then the wrist is passive because the hitting part comes from forearm doing the move. So the wrist is not completely passive. So if I show from a bit close up, so when I'm going in the topspin serve, I'm in this position and I'm going to accelerate upwards like this. So this is going to be my acceleration. I'm going to come around and this is what's going to happen at the end. So the wrist is not doing this, obviously, right? It's not doing extension and flexion. But it is doing, if you Google it or you look at anatomical terms, it's doing abduction, adduction, right? So this is abduction and this is adduction. So the wrist is active in this plane. So if I show like this, it's active in this plane. It's not active in this plane. We're not hitting a topspin serve like this, but we are accelerating the racket head up. So when I'm like this and I'm accelerating the racket head up, the wrist is not passive, it's doing this. You see, I can do this with my hand and I accelerate the racket head and my forearm is still in the same place. So it's not just forearm. If my wrist was completely passive, I would have accelerated this way with my arm, so it would be okay, but I'm missing on this. So that's what the wrist does. The wrist accelerates from this position to this position. It's a small move, but it's a very active move. You can see how much I can accelerate here. So if I show you like this, I can accelerate here and spin the ball. So I'll try and record with a slow motion camera that you see what happens. I'm not sure if I'm gonna get it right at that height, but just for you that you're clear that the wrist is not passive when we're hitting a topspin serve, it's active. And so you don't really have to know that, you just have to follow the drills that I show in the course, right? So the drills are, okay, finish like this, so start like this and finish like this. So obviously while the wrist is doing this, there's also pronation going on and internal shoulder rotation, so it's quite a complex movement and it's difficult for you to break it down which body part or which joint is doing what. So my point is, you don't have to break it down analytically, just do the drill. And if you do the drill right, if you follow and you have the right starting point and you have the right finish point, then all the body parts are going to do the right thing anyway. So while you're doing the drill, you're doing everything right. Try not to simplify such a complex movement that we do here into forearm is active, wrist is not active. It's not that simple. It's more complex. So again, wrist is active in this plane, abduction, adduction. So let's take a look at the wrist action and the rest of the body part motions on a topspin serve in super slow motion. So I recorded this in 200 frames per second, so we can look at it in very small detail. So here's a topspin serve. I just play it one time for you that you can visualize what happened in this serve. And so if we go a bit slower here and now we start observing the hand. So you can see that the hand, the wrist is kind of in this abduction position. And from here I can start pulling up, right? So there will be some effort or some force going this way in this plane, right? So that's how I accelerate the racket, because I want this racket head to accelerate up. So obviously my triceps is going to work here because it's extending the forearm. So that would be kind of like the main force that's extending. So if I clear again, so I would be looking for force from the triceps to extend the forearm, but I'm also able to use the hand here to help push the racket this way up, right? So these are the main sources of power, and so that's the role of the wrist. So the wrist is gonna go here, and it's gonna try and go from abduction to adduction. So it's pushing this way. So that's the role of the wrist. So now what happens during the serve or a little bit later, obviously, is that the wrist is not snapping, because if the wrist was snapping, then we wouldn't have a straight line here. If the wrist was snapping, we would have a line here, and then we would have a line there. We would snap, but you can see that here is flat. So the wrist is not snapping through the serve. It could be just like an optical illusion. When you see this, it can kind of deceive you, that you think, oh, because you see this break of the line, it looks like the wrist is snapping, but you can see that here's a straight line, so that's not a wrist action. It's here internal shoulder rotation action, and the forearm is doing the pronation, and so that's why it looks like that, right? So but by now the ball is flying off, so that's not really affecting the flight of the ball. So what's really affecting the flight of the ball is the action here. If I minimize a little bit, so it's what happens from here to about here. This is what's hitting the ball. And so if you watch my hand, you can see that the hand is active in this plane, right? So it's not active in that plane towards the court, but it's active in this plane across the court, so here. So that's what the hand does. It's a shorter action, so it's just there in the wrist. The wrist is going from abduction to adduction, and it's adding its own component of power to the whole serve. Here's the serve from a different angle that you can also picture this way, so you can see how the racket is lagging down and the hand and the wrist are down, and now the acceleration up starts to happen, and so I can help on the way up. I can help on the way up to accelerate towards the ball with the hand, right? So I oftentimes point the roll of the index finger here below the handle, so you can see that my fingers are spread and that the base of the index finger is below the handle. So from this perspective, it's really below the handle, like at this stage. You can see it's really below the handle, and I'm using my hand and the sensation of the index finger to really push the racket head up into the ball. So adding that little component. Of course, there are other components. So here was shoulder rotation. You can see shoulder rotation. The legs did their thing. The hips are doing their thing. So the triceps is extending the forearm up and so on. And so the last link of the chain, so this whole chain has now worked. The arm is extended, and now comes the wrist, the hand, and the hand is trying to spin up the ball. So speed up the racket to spin up the ball. And so you can see that in the process of hitting the ball, there is no wrist snap, right? If there was wrist snap, then the racket would have gone this way. So at the moment of hitting, the wrist is not snapping, you see? So it's just going from abduction to adduction. So this is the moment of hitting the ball. So you can see here the wrist does this, and then it does this. And so now the rest of the body parts are going to continue working. The internal shoulder rotation keeps happening, and that's what will start to turn the racket. The pronation is starting to happen, and so on. And then the topspin serve is finished. So hopefully this clears up the issue of what happens with the wrist on the topspin serve.